today. Thanks for joining us for these series of interviews with our succession planning specialists. Family farm businesses, as you know, are very complex beasts. They have two systems at play. They have the business with its operations out here in the paddock, back in the workshop or in the office. And then there's the family system, nurturing relationships, raising children, and managing the household. Often these two systems are entwined and they're dependent on each other. We'll be talking to Neil Hooper back in the office about his approach to succession planning. Neil aims to deliver a clear set of goals, concise plan, and a commitment from all of the family members. Let's go have a chat with Neil now. So Neil Hooper, welcome to our series of interviews with our succession planning specialists. I'm intrigued to get an understanding of your approach with succession planning, Neil, because you've developed a bit of a reputation in the industry as one of those people that is a bit of a go-to where succession plans are becoming a little bit stuck or that families don't know where to start. Yeah. And there's quite a lot of advisors and growers coming to you. So I wanted to jump into maybe some of the reasons why. So first question, Neil, is are there some growers out there that still are not dealing with succession planning effectively, and why is that?
Yeah, look, John, I think there's some families out there who are doing it very well, and there's a lot more focus on it these days. But there's still a fairly significant percentage who don't have anything in place, or if they do have something in place, it's a very abstract idea of what it looks like, and with nothing documented. So which obviously leads to various risks there. But there's, like I said, there's a percentage who do it very well, but there's probably still a fairly large percentage who just haven't quite got there because whether they haven't got round to it, or they haven't had the insight or or someone to assist them to get through that process, and they're the ones that sometimes get dragged into to assist. And I guess probably you mentioned, I don't know about my expertise, but it might just mean that I've been around the place a fair while and I know a lot of the consultants and that sort of thing as well. But it's certainly something that it's a challenge for the industry, that's for sure. Yeah,
for sure. Now you mentioned documentation. So what are the risks if you don't document a plan?
Look, I've seen plenty where people say, their succession plan is sorted, and when you actually you ask for the documentation, it's either scribbled on the back of a beer coaster or not documented whatsoever, John. And obviously the risks of that are, at the time, probably everyone has quite a clear understanding of what was decided. Yeah. But if there's no minutes of the meeting, or if there's nothing documented, or if there's not a deed of family arrangement documented, in the first instance, if there's nothing documented, 5 years later, when the plan comes to fruition, everyone's idea of the original plan may have well and truly changed. Yeah. Even when they do go through the process and there is an agreement in writing, if that is then not put into a deed of family arrangement or other legal documents, if there is ever a dispute, or if an off-farm family member, for instance, wants to know what the background story was, upon the demise of one of the parents or something like that, if there's no agreement there, you risk that there's going to be a dispute basically, and the family disharmony and the angst to the business and the angst to the family group, really.
Yeah, no one really wants that, do they? I think having that, having a fallback to go to and look at why decisions were made, is ultimately important. And it's probably, I'll lead you into maybe the next question I wanted to ask is, are you seeing that families are revisiting some of their succession plans more often now, and maybe why is that?
Yeah, look, I think in general, like some plans we've put in place, 5 or 10 years out from the actual transfer of the ownership or control. So I think in those cases, it is important that they're reviewed again every year to 2 years sort of thing, because circumstances change over the course of time. Another block of farmland is purchased, for instance, the debt levels change considerably. Perhaps another sibling decides to come back to the farm, or, the circumstances change quite regularly. And if you don't revisit that long-term plan, it can become quite outdated very quickly. That's where you've got maybe a fairly broad-reaching plan, statement of intent, but everyone knows that it's not necessarily a legally binding document at that point in time, but it's just a statement of direction from everyone.
Something to work towards.
Yeah, correct.
I suppose you were talking about things change. Well,
Yep.
fundamentally in the industry, there's been some major changes.
Absolutely, yes.
The rise of value of farmlands.
Yeah,
And did you want to make some comment about that?
Look, I think that is probably one of the challenges to the industry, or one of the challenges to what we do in relation to succession planning and to growers. The $10 million farming operation 10 years ago is now potentially a $25 million farming operation due to a combination of profitable years and land values increasing, substantially over that period of time. So, and over that period of time, if the off-farm assets haven't grown proportionately, which in many cases they haven't, what might start off as a $10 million farming asset and a $2 million off-farm asset now is a $25 million farming asset and a $2.5 or $3 million off-farm asset. So that disparity is just getting bigger, and that is a real issue.
So that's causing a difference in expectation between the off-farm kids. They're looking at their little pot, if you like, and making that assessment of fair and equal.
Yeah, absolutely. Potentially, it raises that risk, doesn't it? It's and it's a very, very difficult concept, that fair versus equitable or fair versus equal. You never or rarely are you going to have that position where the off-farm siblings can receive the same amount of wealth at the point of succession than the on-farm sibling. But it's still got to be done as fairly as possible, and that perception of fairness, to a large extent, that's in the parents' viewpoint. But I always suggest that they should get some legal advice on to make sure that it is within the realms of possibility, because there's no point putting something in place that potentially is going to be contestable. But going back to the overall farm value, you still need that critical mass of farmland, etc., to be viable as well. So it makes it hard. Just because the farm value is now 25 mil or 20 mil versus 10 mil, it's doubled in value. But you still need that core acreage to make to make the operations work. So you don't like to see the farm being split up as such, because I don't think that leaves a viable alternative there. And I sort of have some basic principles. Number one is security for the older generation. I think that is number one priority in any succession plan. Number two is viability for the next generation, because if it's not viable to them, the farm may as well be sold in the first instance. Rather than going through the succession process and leaving a non-viable farming operation.
You were talking about making sure that the older generation are looked after, and that, I suppose, that trade-off is between what's been left to the younger generation in the form of off-farm and farm.
Yes.
Whose responsibility does it lie with to make that decision ultimately? Who do you...
Yeah, look, I guess it's a combination of advisors to predominantly the older generation, I believe, there. So we would generally sort of meet with the older generation first to see what their understanding or what they want to achieve out of it, then meet separately with the younger generation just to see what they view as being a fair scenario. And sometimes their viewpoints are quite close, sometimes they're very, very disparate sort of things. So ideally, you want to, over the course of time, bring them closer together and try to, I don't know if negotiate's the right word, because I don't like being the negotiator in these. I'd rather be called the mediator in these and let them come to that decisions. But a lot of it's about expectations, trying to set those expectations to both the farm and the non-farm siblings very early in the piece. I think that's where it's great when you've got discussions when people come back to the farm at whether they come back at 20 or 25 or 30, having a discussion up front and knowing what the expectations are. And I think it is definitely the older generation's responsibility to make sure that the off-farm siblings who may not be directly involved in those discussions, I think it is the older generation's responsibility to have that discussion with the off-farm siblings and create that expectation and let them know what what is going to happen at the point of succession. It gives them the opportunity to raise any concerns they've got at that point in time. But once again, it also sets that expectation that you're not going to get a 1/3 share of the farm, etc.
So Neil, you talk about expectations, and I suppose some of those expectations are born out of relationships that that the growers have with their advisors.
Yes.
And
yep.
generally speaking, the older generation has had a longer term relationship
Yeah.
with, let's say, with an accountant
Yes,
or a
yep.
farm advisor.
Yep.
Does that cause any issues?
It certainly can do. You know, the younger generation can potentially see the advisor as being, you know, mum and dad's advisor and not our advisor. It can potentially cause conflicts of interest to, you know, the accountant or the consultant or whoever is trying to get the succession plan up and running. But once again, I think it's just a matter of trying to communicate as well as possible. You know, I've seen circumstances where I've been invited into succession matters where it is completely stalled, where the younger generation just see that the accountant is operating purely for mum and dad, and they're not getting a say. You know, it is a fairly one that we have to tread fairly carefully with that conflict of interest, and sometimes, you know, we do set up a bit of a Chinese wall, and we have a younger or another person involved with the younger generation and someone dealing with the older generation, because I think everyone, you know, needs to have a right to be heard at that important point in time. But also, if there's a perception that you're operating for the older generation, the younger generation need to feel that they've got someone that they can talk to who can raise their points of view as well.
It's a good solution to that barrier, isn't it? Like if you've got more than one advisor involved, separating out and getting a bit of that third party or different viewpoint.
Yeah. And it's not something we do every time, but it's something that we have to be very aware of, I suppose. And if you get that feeling that, you know, the younger generation don't feel like they're being heard, you know, we need to go out of our way to have a discussion with them and find out what their you know, issues are, or try to help them to be heard. But if they still have that perception that you're acting for dad and mum, then you need to get another person involved, whether that's another accountant internally, you know, or whether it's the consultant sort of more so working with that operation. It probably works the opposite as well, because in a lot of cases, the younger generation are going to be the long-term client going forward, aren't they? Particularly for the consultant and probably for the accountant sort of thing. So, you know, you could argue that there could be a perception from mum and dad that the accountant is working for the younger generation. You know, it's a very hard one to try to balance. And honestly, it's very hard sometimes not to pick a side when sometimes there's an argument and there's a motive argument there. But until you know the background, it's very hard to, you know. Look, I quite often find it's much easier to do a succession plan for a client that you've been involved in for, you know, 10 years than to be invited into a succession meeting with non-clients where you don't know the family members so well and you don't know the background issues, you know, because you might take you sometimes 2 or 3 meetings to just get a feel for, you know, what these issues are and what the personalities are and those sort of things. So, it can be quite difficult.
It seems to be, I think the analogy has been used before, it seems to be like unpacking a present. You know, you don't know really what's there until you start unpacking it. Neil, you're obviously doing something right, because I really appreciate you've got a wonderful balanced view, I think, with these things, and that's why people are coming to you to seek assistance. If you had to wrap up this and give a few takeaways, what would they be?
Communication, absolutely number one by the length of the straight, really. Communication between the two generations, and if they're not communicating, then it's really the role of the accountant or the consultant or the, you know, whatever other advice they use to try to bring that communication together. Communication leads to expectation, you know, so as I said before, I think that's really critical first up. And then those 3 principles, you know, certainly financial ability and stability for the older generation is number one, viability for the younger generation, and if it's not documented, it hasn't happened. It must be documented.
Excellent, Neil. Very good message there. Thank you very much.
Cheers, John. Thank you.